at Standing Stone State Park today and trying to get some footage of a basswood tree. Okay, here we got some growing right beside the stream, which is very typical of basswood in this part of the country. They generally like moist but well-drained soils. The bark on the basswood tree looks a lot like tulip poplar, except that if you recall from our tulip poplar video, the ridges are dark on the tulip poplar and the furrows are light colored. It's just the opposite on the basswood. See, if you'll take a look at some of these leaves here, you'll see the leaves are heart-shaped, but they're not perfectly symmetrical. A little bit shorter on one side. The basswood is Tilia americana. There are some other varieties we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later on, but I just wanted to get out in the field and let you see what some of these look like growing now. Of course, they've already bloomed this year. We're here in mid-August, and if you take a look on the ground, you can see some of the leftover bracts are associated with each cluster of blooms, and it's believed that they could possibly be flags for nighttime pollinators, moths in particular. I wish we could have got here a little sooner and caught this one in bloom, maybe next year. We unfortunately don't have a lot of these trees around home at our elevation. You'll sometimes find them down in hollows close to creeks and stuff. But anyway, folks, the amazing basswood tree, it's known as the bee tree in many parts of its range due to the abundance of nectar in some years. It's said that you can get a surplus of nectar on average 2 out of every 5 years, and occasionally it'll just be an amazing flow. Okay, here we can take a close-up look at the leaves. And you can see these are quite large. They can be as large as 7 inches and sometimes as small as 3 inches. They have serrations on them. You can tell when you look real close. They look a lot like eastern redbud leaves, except that they have a smooth margin. But several of these growing along the creek here. And a beautiful setting. Here's a young example. You can tell the very characteristic leaves. Look how smooth the bark looks when they're young. But stay tuned, folks. We'll talk a little bit more about the amazing basswood tree. And thanks so much for tuning in. Here's a swinging bridge. I'll give y'all a view of the lake here in a minute. Hey folks, thanks for hanging around. We're back at the computer and wanted to take a look at some pictures and talk more about the American basswood tree. Before I do that though, I wanted to give a huge thank you to Dr. Daniel Combs, the Dendrology professor at Tennessee Technological University, for pointing me to Standing Stone State Park to find some basswood trees there. And I'll leave a link in the description of this video to Standing Stone State Park. And if you're ever in the area, go check it out. It's Hilham, Tennessee. It's not too far from the Kentucky state line. But let's get into it, folks. American basswood, the scientific name is Tilia americana. It has several alternate names, the most common one probably being American linden or linden. You'll sometimes hear it called just simply lin. It's also known as the bee tree in some parts of its range, generally north of here. Our southern summers aren't really conducive to it being as prolific as it is in more northern parts of its range. The bark, as you can see here, is light gray and smooth. It gets darker with age. It has shallow vertical ridges. According to the USDA, it can get as tall as 130 feet. A lot of resources you look at say 80 to to 100, maybe 120. But it really just depends on what part of the country you live in. And there are a few different varieties of the basswood tree. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. And the trunk size can be 36 to 48 inches at maturity. Here's a good close-up of the leaves. You can see they're heart-shaped, but they're not perfectly symmetrical. One of the lobes is slightly lower. They're pinnately compound. You can see they've got some sawtooth edges to them. The leaves are kind of shiny on top and paler beneath. Here's a picture of the national champion basswood tree. You can find out more about national champion trees by going to American Forest Champion Tree site. I'll put a link to that in the description of the video. This one is Lexington, Kentucky, and its trunk circumference is 276 inches, 102 feet tall, with a crown spread of 85.5 feet. And it was last measured in 2016, so it's probably even bigger now. Hopefully it's still doing well. It blooms in late spring to early summer, and you'll generally have 5 to 20 flowers on a cluster hanging down. And you can see behind that cluster of flowers there is a little leafy structure. And that is a strap-shaped leafy bract that's attached to each of one of the flower clusters. It's been theorized that that can serve as a flag for nighttime pollinators. The fruit is a tiny nutlet and enjoyed by various birds and mammals, and that's one of the main seed dispersal mechanisms, and also wind and gravity. Fall color is a yellow, pale yellow. It's not really particularly showy. You can see here one of the leafy bracts and some of the nutlets still hanging on. American basswood is prized as a carving wood, and it's been used historically for that, and still to this day is used for that. Furniture, also paper, pulpwood, kegs, lumber, Venetian blinds, and just to name a few. There's a long list of things that it's used for. You know, that ability to be able to carve it, of course, means it's a little softer. It's also susceptible to decay. You can see in the photograph here the woodpecker damage, which makes it great nesting sites for ducks, woodpeckers, and small mammals, and sometimes bee colonies. Here's a picture of a little critter called the leaf roller. Pretty interesting. I didn't look into it too much, but I noticed this before in a lot of the pictures, and seeing leaves curled up, and here's what's doing that. You can see a couple pictures here. There's the larva stage and then the adult moth stage. Also, too, you may have noticed when we were out at the park there and getting some of the video footage, some of the leaves look kind of like the leaves in this picture here. And that's caused by the leaf miner. And you can see a picture of an adult one there. And apparently it doesn't cause any significant health problems to the tree other than just aesthetics. All right, let's talk about the different varieties now. In a resource that I've got from, let's see, you may not be able to see this. This was a book I had in college, and it's from, it was last revised in 1980. And it talked about these different basswood trees being totally different species. Well, sometimes since then, they're all considered Tilia americana, but they're different variants. You have the heterophylla and the Carolinia, and then there's also a Mishoxi. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, but I think that the Mishoxi and the heterophylla are considered synonymous now. But either way, you can see from these range maps here, between those three variants or varieties, it covers a significant portion of the U.S. and on up into Canada as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the farther north you go, it's a more important for lumber and also too for honey production. Basswood honey is a premium honey. It's said to have a light flavor, and when you read about different descriptions of the flavor, you hear things like lemon zest, buttery, minty. Very interesting. I can't really say that I would know if I ever tasted any. I would love to get over to Bob Minnie's place sometime and sample the different honeys. I trust him. He seems to take pride in making sure that that whatever it says on the label is what's in the honey. And so I would love to be able to get a sample pack so I could learn for myself what the different tastes are. Please leave comments if you have familiarity with what pure basswood honey tastes like and how you like it compared to sourwood and poplar honey, other things like that maybe. From what I'm reading, there are excellent nectar flows at least 2 out of 5 years, which, sounded kind of a bummer to me, but hey, I guess it would be great 2 out of 5 years, but occasionally there's an amazing flow. And so if you have any feedback on that, let me know. For instance, if you have a lot of basswoods and you get great flows every year, please leave that in the comments, not only for me, but for anybody else that may take a look at that. I generally talk about honeybee.net on a lot of these videos, and I want to mention it again because when I go into honeybee.net and click on my region and I look at the different sources, as I've mentioned before, I know you probably can't see this, but you can check it out for yourself on the computer and go in and look at your region. You'll see some sources highlighted, which means that that's considered a significant source. But that's not the case for me here. Even though basswood is listed as a significant source, it would really only be a minor source at best for me. But obviously these are large scale maps, generalized, which bring me to the point I wanted to make. Things like honeybee.net and some of the old literature, Honey Plants in North America and stuff like that, serve as excellent resources to kind of give you a starting point, an idea of what your nectar sources are. But it's something that you can then dial in by experience. The Dirt Rooster did a video, I don't know, I guess it's been a few months ago now, where he suggested, and it's something he does, he maintains a log of the bloom cycle of things in his area every year. And I thought that was such a simple, genius idea to do and keep up with that. And I've been trying to do that with just videos on my phone. But I do need to start keeping a notebook. But anyway, if you have no idea, this is a great starting point, but you can't rely on it 100%. And as I've mentioned before, some of these sources that are considered minor on here, actually, I would think are a better than a minor source for me. But having said that, I'll leave a link to honeybee.net in the description of the video, as always. And looking at some of the old literature I mentioned a moment ago, Honey Plants in North America, John Lovell's book from 1926, I couldn't find a PDF. Of course, you can find this online and purchase it, $20, $25, stuff like that. But it's an old book. It's in the public domain. I did find one site that has it. It's part of their website, but you sort of have to kind of click through page by page, or you can manually enter in the page number after you figure out which page you want to go to by looking at the index. And so I'll put a link to that site in the description of the video. And that's where I pulled this information out from. But the main reason I did this, I'm not going to read all this to you, but I wanted to reiterate the point I made earlier about how things change in the scientific information over time, as I'm sure you well know. But in this case, back then they considered those different varieties of Tilia americana as totally different species. I just want to share that with you. But again, there'll be a link to Honey Plants in North America in sort of a web version format, if you will, in the description of the video. All right, let's take a look at the historical use. One of the main ones is the inner bark is known as bast, and apparently that's how the name basswood came about. And that the bast is a really good source of fiber to make ropes, mats, fish nets, and baskets. They keep it in bundles just like you see here, and then boil it prior to use. The basswood, as we mentioned, it's really desirable for carving. The Iroquois Indians used the basswood to carve ceremonial mats. They would actually carve it into the living basswood tree and then cut it off and hollow it out. Prior to the advancement and then using the synthetics for prosthetic limbs, the basswood was the material of choice. Here's a photo from 1918 with a prosthetic limb company that was based out of Minneapolis. You can see the products there on the wall, and looks like some pieces of basswood maybe stored on the shelf in the back there. Here was a really cool picture I came across of the Ojibwe tribe constructing a wigwam. This was at a place called Millie Lacs Trading Post. I may not be pronouncing that right. This is in 1920, and they were using the elm and balsam fir for the framework, but were using basswood string to tie it all together. When you start looking at some of the herbal medicinal uses for basswood, the list is very long. And of course, I've never tried any of these for any of this stuff, folks. My grandpa he was an herbalist, and anytime you had any kind of an ailment, he'd say, "I'll be right back," and he would come back with a root or some bark or something, and instruct you on how to use it. And I missed so many golden opportunities to learn a lot of that stuff from him. But anyway, I really think there's a lot to natural herbal medicines. But please take that with a grain of salt, and always seek competent medical advice before taking anything, and do your own research on it. But I'll put a link in the video description of a site called Plants for a Future, and it lists several medicinal uses for basswood, and you can take a look at that. I'll just read a few to you here real quick. A poultice of the leaves has been used in treatment of burns and scalds, broken bones, and swollen areas. A tea or tincture made from the leaves, flowers, and buds has traditionally been used for nervous headaches, restlessness, and painful digestion. So, well, that's it, folks. I wanted to share some pictures with you and talk a little bit more about the basswood tree. And I so much appreciate you watching my videos, and I would appreciate you subscribing if you haven't, and liking and commenting. May God bless you, God bless your family, and God bless your bees. And we'll see you next time. Okay, folks, as promised, I was going to give you a view of the lake. Beautiful little lake here at Standing Stone State Park. It's a good fishing hole. Y'all stay tuned. We're going to talk more about basswood trees, take a look at some pictures and stuff. Thank y'all for tuning in. Little narrow single lane road going across the dam. Right down there's the creek where we took a look at the basswood trees. These old stone guardrails were built by the CCC back during the Depression.